Blue and red lights pierced the silence of the desolate highway, flashing against the armored plating of a matte black Mercedes G-Wagon. Inside the cabin sat a man who had spent 2 decades executing classified operations, a commander whose clearance level superseded the local government. Behind him sat Officer Joel Norman, a patrolman whose insecurity was about to trigger a national security incident his badge couldn't survive. This wasn't just a routine pullover. It was a collision of lethal discipline and reckless ego that would leave one man liberated and the other in federal custody. When the convoy of military SUVs finally swarmed the precinct hours later, it wouldn't just be a rescue mission. It would be a tactical dismantling of a corrupt officer that the department would never recover from. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m., and Officer Joel Norman was 3 hours into a shift that felt like drowning in molasses. He'd written 2 speeding tickets to soccer moms who cried, 1 warning to a kid with a busted headlight, and spent 40 minutes parked behind a gas station, scrolling through his ex-girlfriend's Instagram. She was in Cancun with some finance bro who probably couldn't bench 225. Norman could. Not that it mattered anymore. He adjusted his rear-view mirror and studied his own face. Square jaw, decent hairline, the kind of look that should have made detective by now. But here he was, 5 years in, still writing tickets on Highway 29 while guys like Martinez got promoted for kissing the captain's ass. Norman didn't kiss ass. He got results, or he would if anyone ever gave him a real case. The highway stretched empty in both directions, a black ribbon cutting through pine forests that swallowed sound. This close to Fort Bragg, you got all kinds of traffic: military contractors, off-duty soldiers in pickup trucks, the occasional convoy that made the asphalt hum. Norman had learned to spot the difference between a grunt's beat-up Camaro and the kind of vehicle that meant money. Real money. The kind that didn't come from a government paycheck. That's when he saw it. Matte black Mercedes G-Wagon, blacked-out windows, no front license plate. It rolled past him doing exactly 63 in a 65, which was the first red flag. Nobody drove under the speed limit at midnight unless they had something to hide. The vehicle was immaculate, aggressive, the kind of SUV that cost more than Norman made in 2 years. He felt his pulse quicken as he pulled out behind it, keeping a car length back. The G-Wagon didn't flinch, didn't speed up, didn't slow down, just maintained that perfect, irritating pace. Norman ran the rear plate through his system. North Carolina registration, current tags, no warrants. Registered to a P. Taylor at an address in Fayetteville. Clean as a whistle, which meant absolutely nothing. The smart ones always kept their paperwork tight. Norman had watched enough DEA documentaries to know how it worked. Luxury vehicles, legal registrations, compartments welded into the frame where you could hide anything from cash to kilos. He squinted at the silhouette in the driver's seat. Male, broad shoulders, sitting perfectly upright. No passenger. No music thumping. No erratic movement. The guy drove like a machine, which was the second red flag. Normal people fidgeted. They checked their phones at red lights, adjusted the radio, scratched their neck. This driver sat like he was carved from stone. Norman's instincts were screaming now. This wasn't some rich kid joyriding daddy's SUV. This was someone who knew how to move product, how to stay invisible. Probably ex-military, using his training to run drugs up the I-95 corridor. It happened more than people wanted to admit. Guys came back from deployment, couldn't find work, fell in with the wrong crowd. Norman had busted 2 of them last year. both with enough fentanyl in their trunks to kill a neighborhood. He clicked his tongue against his teeth, weighing his options. He had no probable cause. The vehicle was legal, the driving was perfect. Us and his captain had already chewed him out twice this month for aggressive stops without justification. But Norman knew what his gut was telling him. This was the one. This was the bust that would get him noticed, maybe even fast-track him to narcotics. He just needed a reason. His eyes traced the G-Wagon's taillights, both glowing red and fully functional. The tint looked legal. No visible damage, no... Wait. Norman leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. Was that a crack in the left taillight? He couldn't quite tell in the dark, but it didn't matter. By the time they reviewed dashcam footage, if it ever came to that, he'd make sure there was a crack. A little tap with his baton during the stop. Blame it on the suspect backing up. Easy. He flipped on his lights. The blue and red strobes exploded across the highway, painting the trees in violent color. Norman expected the G-Wagon to hesitate, to speed up, to do something that would confirm his suspicions. Instead, the vehicle's right turn signal clicked on immediately. It decelerated smoothly and pulled onto the shoulder with the precision of a driver's ed instructor. Norman felt a flicker of unease, but he crushed it under a surge of adrenaline. He radioed dispatch with his location and plate number, then stepped out of his cruiser. His hand drifted to his holster, fingers brushing the grip of his Glock. The night air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of pine and asphalt. He approached the driver's side window, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. And that's when he saw the man's eyes in the side mirror. Calm, unblinking, and utterly devoid of fear. Norman's boots crunched gravel as he approached the driver's side, his flashlight beam sweeping across the G-Wagon's flawless exterior. Up close, the vehicle looked even more expensive. Custom armor plating along the doors, reinforced side panels, the kind of modifications that cost 6 figures. Nobody needed a truck like this unless they were either protecting something valuable or expecting trouble. His hand stayed on his holster, thumb resting against the retention strap. Standard procedure, he told himself, though his heart was hammering harder than it should have been. Through the tinted window, he could make out the driver's silhouette, motionless except for the steady rise and fall of breathing. Norman rapped his knuckles against the glass. "Driver, roll down your window." The window descended with a hydraulic whisper, and Norman got his first clear look at the man inside. Black male, mid-30s, clean-shaven with a jawline that could have been cut from granite. He wore a plain black compression shirt that did nothing to hide the kind of build you didn't get from a gym membership. Shoulders like bowling balls, forearms corded with muscle, posture so rigid it looked painful. But it was the eyes that made Norman's stomach tighten. They were dark, calm, and focused with the kind of intensity that made you feel like you were being assessed, catalogued, and dismissed all at once. Both of the man's hands rested on top of the steering wheel at 10 and 2, fingers relaxed, palms down. He didn't turn his head to look at Norman. He stared straight ahead through the windshield, as if the officer didn't exist. "License and registration," Norman said, his voice coming out harder than he intended. "My documents are in the center console," the man said. His voice was low, controlled, each word measured like ammunition. "I'm going to reach for them now." He moved with the kind of deliberate slowness that should have been reassuring, but somehow wasn't. His right hand lifted from the wheel, fingers spread to show they were empty, then descended to the console. The motion was so smooth, it looked rehearsed. He retrieved a black leather wallet and a registration card, then returned his hand to the wheel, before extending the documents toward Norman with his left. Norman snatched them, shining his flashlight on the license. Patrick Taylor, age 36, Fayetteville address. The photo matched. Same hard face, same unsettling stare. Norman flipped to the registration. Everything current. Everything legal, which only made him more suspicious. "You know why I pulled you over, Mr. Taylor?" "No, officer." Taylor's gaze remained fixed forward. He hadn't blinked once since the window came down. "Your left taillight's got a crack in it. That's a safety violation. The vehicle passed inspection 2 weeks ago." Still no emotion, no defensiveness. Just facts delivered in that same flat tone. Norman felt heat crawl up his neck. "Well, it's cracked now. Where are you coming from tonight?" "I'm not required to answer that question." The words hit Norman like a slap. His jaw clenched. "Excuse me?" "I'm not required to disclose my travel history without probable cause." Taylor's hands hadn't moved. His breathing hadn't changed. He spoke like he was reading from a manual. Norman leaned closer, letting his flashlight beam drift across the interior. The cabin was immaculate. No fast food bags, no air fresheners, no personal items except a stainless steel travel mug in the cup holder. The back seat was empty except for a hard-shell briefcase secured with a seatbelt. Everything about this screamed operational security, the kind of discipline you learned in the military or the kind of paranoia you developed running illegal shipments. "You former military, Mr. Taylor?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss my employment." "That's a yes or no question." "I'm not at liberty to discuss my employment," Taylor repeated, his tone unchanged. Norman's fingers tightened on his flashlight. This guy was playing games, hiding behind some pseudo-legal bullshit he probably learned from YouTube. Normal people got nervous during traffic stops. They rambled, made excuses, tried to charm their way out of tickets. This man sat like a statue, giving nothing, which meant he had everything to hide. "Step out of the vehicle, please." For the first time, Taylor's eyes shifted. They slid sideways to meet Norman's, and the officer felt something cold slither down his spine. It wasn't fear in those eyes. It wasn't anger. It was calculation, the kind of look a predator gives when deciding whether something is a threat or just an annoyance. "Officer, I'm advising you to call your supervisor before this proceeds further." "I don't need a supervisor to conduct a traffic stop. Step out of the vehicle. Now." Taylor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're making a mistake. The only mistake here is you thinking you can tell me how to do my job." Norman's hand moved from his holster to his baton. "I'm not going to ask again. Out of the vehicle. Hands where I can see them." The silence stretched for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then Taylor's hands moved to the door handle, and Norman stepped back, his pulse roaring in his ears, convinced he was about to crack the case that would define his career. He had no idea he'd just triggered a national security incident. The door opened with a heavy thunk that spoke to the vehicle's armored construction, and Patrick Taylor stepped onto the shoulder with the same mechanical precision he'd used for everything else. He stood a full head taller than Norman, maybe 6'3", with the kind of presence that made the highway feel smaller. His boots were black tactical Salomons, worn but maintained. His jeans were dark and fitted. Everything about him was functional, stripped of anything unnecessary. Norman's hand drifted back to his holster. "Hands on the hood, feet apart." Taylor complied without a word, assuming the position with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before, or trained others to do it. His palms pressed flat against the matte black paint, his stance wed and balanced. Norman noticed the way the man's shoulders stayed loose, despite the tension of the moment. Most people locked up during a stop like this. Taylor looked like he was waiting in line at the DMFI. "You carrying any weapons? Anything that's going to stick me or hurt me?" "I'm not required to answer that without probable cause for a search." Norman's teeth ground together. "That's twice now you've quoted law at me. You a lawyer, Mr. Taylor?" "No." "Then where'd you learn to be such a pain in my ass?" Taylor said nothing. His breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged. Norman circled around to the passenger side, shining his flashlight through the windows, looking for anything. A bag of pills, a weapon, drug residue, anything that would justify what he was about to do. The interior was clean, aggressively clean, the kind of clean that felt wrong. "What's in the briefcase?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss that." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I can provide." Norman stopped circling and planted himself directly behind Taylor, close enough to smell the faint scent of gun oil and something else. CLP, the military cleaning solvent. "Let me tell you what I think, Mr. Taylor. I think you're moving product. I think this fancy truck is a cover, and I think whatever's in that case is worth more than you want to admit. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to open that case. You're going to let me search this vehicle. And if you cooperate, maybe this goes easy." "I cannot consent to a search." "Cannot or will not?" "Both." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Norman felt his face flush hot. He'd given this guy every opportunity to make this simple, and instead, he was getting stonewalled by someone who thought his muscles and his lawyer talk made him untouchable. Norman had dealt with guys like this before, ex-military types who thought their service gave them a pass to do whatever they wanted. They forgot that the badge was the authority out here, not their DD-214. "You think you're special?" Norman's voice rose despite himself. "You think because you've got a nice truck and you know a few legal phrases that you're above the law?" Taylor's head turned slightly, just enough for Norman to see his profile. "Officer, I'm asking you one more time to contact your supervisor. This situation can still be resolved without incident. You don't get to make demands. But I'm the one with the badge, and I'm the one with clearance you don't have the authorization to verify." Norman barked out a laugh. "Clearance? What, you got a top-secret briefcase full of alien technology? You watch too many movies, buddy." "I'm not at liberty to discuss the contents of that case or my current operational status. What I can tell you is that detaining me will trigger a federal response that will end your career." The threat landed like a punch. Norman's vision tunneled, his hands curling into fists. This son of a bitch was actually threatening him. Not with violence. That would have been easier to handle. But with some phantom federal boogeyman that probably didn't exist outside of this asshole's imagination. "You know what I think?" Norman stepped closer, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "I think you're full of shit. I think you're a drug dealer with a good story, and you're betting I'm too scared to call your bluff. I'm not bluffing. Then prove it. Show me some ID that says you're James Bond. Show me a badge, a card, anything that makes you more than just another asshole in an expensive truck." "I can't do that." "Can't or won't?" "Both." Norman's hand shot out and grabbed Taylor's shoulder, spinning him around. The man moved with the momentum, turning to face Norman with that same infuriating calm. Up close, Norman could see the faint scars on Taylor's knuckles, the kind you got from breaching doors or breaking faces. Could see the way his eyes tracked everything. Norman's gun hand, his stance, the distance to the cruiser, processing threats with the speed of a computer. "Last chance," Norman said, and his voice shaking now with adrenaline and rage. "Open the case. Consent to the search, or I'm taking you in for obstruction." Taylor's expression didn't change. "Then you're making a choice you'll regret for the rest of your life." "The only thing I'm going to regret is not doing this sooner." Norman reached for his cuffs, his heart hammering, his mind already writing the report that would make him a hero. He didn't see the way Taylor's jaw tightened, didn't notice the micro-expression of resignation that flickered across the man's face, didn't understand that he wasn't restraining a criminal. He was compromising a national asset. Norman's cuffs were halfway out of their pouch when his eyes drifted back to the G-Wagon's cargo area. The briefcase in the back seat was one thing, but the real storage was in the rear. That's where they always hid it. The bulk product, the cash bricks, the guns. He'd seen it 100 times on those DEA raid videos. The decoy in plain sight, the real payload, hidden where you needed a warrant to look. "Open the trunk." Taylor's expression finally shifted. Not fear, not anger, something closer to exhaustion. "I can't do that." "You mean you won't do that?" "I mean I am legally prohibited from doing that." Taylor's voice remained level, but there was an edge now, a hairline fracture in that perfect control. "Officer, there is equipment in this vehicle you do not have clearance to view. Opening that compartment without proper authorization is a federal crime." Norman laughed, the sound harsh and ugly in the quiet night. "A federal crime? You're really committing to this bit, aren't you?" "It's not a bit." "Then show me paperwork. Show me something official that says, I can't search your vehicle." "The paperwork is classified." "Of course it is." Norman shook his head, his patience finally snapping like a frayed wire. "You know what? I'm done playing games. You've got two choices. You open that trunk right now, or I open it myself and add resisting to your charges." Taylor's hands were still on the hood, but his entire body had gone rigid. "If you open that compartment, you will trigger a security protocol that will bring federal agents to this location within the hour. You will lose your job. You may lose your freedom. I'm trying to protect you from that outcome." "Protect me?" Norman's voice cracked with disbelief. "You're threatening a police officer during a traffic stop, and you think you're protecting me?" "I'm not threatening you. I'm warning you." "Same difference." Norman moved toward the rear of the G-Wagon, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Pop the trunk, or I'm breaking a window." "Officer, now!" The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Norman could hear his own breathing, harsh and rapid, could hear the distant hum of an 18-wheeler on the highway, could hear absolutely nothing from Taylor, who stood frozen against the hood, like a man watching a child run toward traffic. "I can't open it," Taylor said finally, his voice quieter now. "Even if I wanted to. The rear compartment is biometrically locked and linked to a security system that will alert my chain of command the moment it's breached without proper authorization codes." Norman spun around, his flashlight beam catching Taylor's face. "Your chain of command? What are you, a mall cop with delusions of grandeur?" "I'm an active federal asset, returning from a classified briefing. The equipment in this vehicle is property of the United States government and is protected under national security protocols that supersede local law enforcement authority." The words should have sounded insane. They should have been the ramblings of someone high or delusional, or both. But Taylor delivered them with the same flat certainty he'd used for everything else. And something about that made Norman's stomach twist. "If that's true, then you've got our credentials. Show them to me." "I don't carry credentials that identify my operational status. That would defeat the purpose of operational security." "How convenient." "It's not convenient. It's protocol." Norman stepped closer, his face inches from Taylor's now. "You know what I think? I think you're a drug dealer who watched too many spy movies and thought you could intimidate a cop with some Tom Clancy bullshit. I think you're betting I'm too stupid or too scared to call your bluff. But here's the thing, Mr. Taylor. I'm not stupid. And I'm definitely not scared of you. Taylor's eyes locked onto Norman's, and for the first time, the officer saw something that might have been pity. You should be scared. Not of me. Of what happens next. Is that another threat? It's a fact. Norman's hand moved to his baton, but fingers wrapping around the grip. Last chance. Open the trunk, or I'm smashing a window and opening it myself. If you do that, there's no coming back from it. Good. Norman pulled the baton free, the metal extending with a sharp click. Because I'm tired of you thinking you're in control here. He moved toward the rear passenger window, the baton raised. Taylor pushed off the hood, his voice sharp for the first time. Officer, stop! Norman spun, his free hand going to his gun. Get back on the hood. Hands where I can see them. Taylor raised his hands slowly, palms out. But he didn't move back to the vehicle. You're about to make a mistake that will destroy your life. I'm begging you to stop and think. The only mistake was me wasting time talking to you. Norman turned back to the window, his baton cocked. Well, you had your chance. The glass shattered with a sound like a gunshot, and somewhere in the vehicle's hidden systems, a silent alarm began to scream into the night. The moment the glass shattered, Taylor moved, not toward Norman, away from him, hands still raised, backing toward the shoulder's edge. His face had gone carefully blank, but his eyes tracked Norman's every movement with the focus of a man calculating trajectories. Get back here! Norman's voice cracked high and sharp. The baton was still in his hand, adrenaline singing through his veins like voltage. I said get back here. I'm not resisting, Taylor said, his voice maddeningly calm, even as broken glass glittered on his vehicle's interior. I'm creating distance to de-escalate. You're fleeing. I'm standing still. Norman closed the gap in 3 strides, his baton raised. Hands behind your back, now! Taylor's hands stayed up, palms out. Officer, if you put your hands on me, or this situation will escalate beyond your control. You don't get to tell me what to do. Norman grabbed Taylor's right wrist and yanked it down. It was like trying to move a steel beam. The man's arm didn't budge, not from active resistance, but from pure structural strength. Norman pulled harder, his face flushing red. Taylor let his arm drop slowly, controlled, moving with Norman's force rather than against it. I'm complying. There's no need for violence. But Norman was past hearing. He wrenched Taylor's arm behind his back, and that's when he felt it. The coiled power in the man's frame. The sense that he was trying to restrain a machine that was choosing not to activate. Taylor's other hand came back on its own, assuming the position for cuffing, and somehow that submission felt more threatening than if he'd fought back. When Norman slapped one cuff on, the metal biting into Taylor's wrist. You think you're tough? You think your muscles scare me? I'm not trying to scare you. Taylor's voice was strained now, tight with effort. I'm trying not to hurt you. The words detonated something in Norman's chest. He drove his baton into Taylor's kidney, a sharp jab that should have dropped any normal person to their knees. Taylor grunted, his body tensing, but he stayed upright. His legs didn't buckle. He absorbed the blow like it was an inconvenience. Get down! Norman hit him again, harder this time. On your knees! Taylor's breathing had gone ragged, but he lowered himself slowly, deliberately, maintaining control even as Norman struck him a 3rd time across the shoulders. The man's hands stayed behind his back, at the single cuff dangling from his right wrist. He knelt on the gravel like he was at church, his head bowed, and Norman could see the muscles in his jaw working. "That's right," Norman panted, circling around to face him. "Not so tough now, are you?" Taylor raised his head, and the look in his eyes made Norman take an involuntary step back. It wasn't pain. It wasn't fear. It was restraint, so absolute it looked like agony, the expression of a man using every ounce of discipline not to do what his training screamed at him to do. "I could end you," Taylor said quietly. "Right now, before you could draw your weapon. Do you understand that?" Norman's hand flew to his gun. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact I'm choosing not to act on." Taylor's voice dropped to something almost gentle. "I'm not your enemy, officer. But you need to stop hitting me." The gentleness was worse than any threat. Norman felt something primal and ugly surge up from his gut, the need to make this man break, to prove that the badge meant something, that Norman himself meant something. He grabbed Taylor's shoulder and shoved him forward. "Face down, arms out!" Taylor went down, but not from the shove. He lowered himself with the same controlled precision, spreading his arms wide, pressing his cheek against the gravel. His chest rose and fell with deep, measured breaths. Norman could see his fists clenching and unclenching, the only sign that the man's control was costing him. Norman dropped a knee into Taylor's back, grinding down. "You feel that? That's what happens when you threaten a cop." "I didn't threaten you." The words came out compressed, or forced through a restricted diaphragm. "I warned you." Same thing. Norman reached for the dangling cuff, trying to wrench Taylor's left arm back. The arm moved, but slowly, and Norman could feel the resistance. Not active fighting, but the sheer mechanical difficulty of bending a limb that strong. He pulled harder, his own muscles straining. Taylor's hand twitched, fingers spreading, and Norman saw it. The micro-movement of someone stopping themselves from executing a technique. Some kind of reversal or strike that would have ended the fight before Norman knew it started. Fear spiked through the adrenaline. Norman dropped the cuff and grabbed his taser, ripping it from his belt. "Don't you fucking move!" "I'm not moving." Taylor's voice was barely a whisper now. "I haven't moved." "You were about to." Norman pressed the taser against Taylor's ribs. "You think I didn't see that? I'm not resisting." "Bullshit!" Norman pulled the trigger. 50,000 volts slammed into Taylor's body, and for the first time, the man's control shattered. His back arched, muscles seizing, a sound like a wounded animal tearing from his throat. Norman held the trigger down for 5 seconds, then 7, then 10, watching the way Taylor's fingers clawed at the gravel. When he finally released it, Taylor collapsed flat, his breathing harsh and uneven. Norman didn't wait. He grabbed the left arm, limp now, unresisting, and slapped the second cuff on, cranking them tight enough to bite into skin. "Not so scary now," Norman gasped, his hands shaking as he patted Taylor down. No weapons, no drugs. Just a body built like a weapon itself, now restrained and helpless on the side of the highway. Taylor's eyes were closed, his jaw clenched. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "You have no idea what you've done." Norman hauled him to his feet, shoving him toward the cruiser. "Yeah? Well, you're about to find out what happens to people who threaten cops in my county." He didn't see the way Taylor's lips moved in what might have been a prayer, didn't notice the resignation in the set of his shoulders, didn't understand that the man wasn't praying for himself. He was praying for Norman. Norman shoved Taylor into the back of the cruiser with more force than necessary, the cuffed man's shoulder slamming against the far door. Taylor didn't cry out, didn't curse, just shifted himself upright with the awkward grace of someone whose hands were bound behind them. His face was scraped from the gravel, a thin line of blood trailing from his temple, but his expression remained that same infuriating mask of control. Norman slammed the door hard enough to rock the vehicle, then stood there for a moment, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. His uniform was soaked with sweat, his knuckles aching from where he'd struck Taylor's ribs. The adrenaline was starting to ebb, leaving behind a jittery exhaustion and something else, a whisper of doubt he crushed immediately under a wave of vindication. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. Taken down a suspect who could have killed him, someone who was clearly dangerous, clearly hiding something. The G-Wagon sat on the shoulder with its shattered window glittering under his cruiser's lights, looking less like a luxury vehicle now and more like evidence. Norman pulled out his phone and snapped a few photos, the broken glass, the expensive interior, the briefcase still strapped into the back seat. His captain would have to see this. Everyone would have to see this. He walked back to the driver's side and slid in, adjusting his rearview mirror to get a clear view of his passenger. Taylor sat perfectly centered in the seat, his back straight despite the cuffs, staring at the metal grate that separated them. His breathing had returned to that slow, measured rhythm, like he was meditating. Norman started the engine and pulled onto the highway, the G-Wagon disappearing behind them into the darkness. "You got a phone call coming when we get to the station," he said, his voice still rough with exertion. "You might want to use it to get yourself a good lawyer." Taylor said nothing. His eyes remained fixed forward, unblinking. "Strong silent type, huh?" Norman adjusted his grip on the wheel, feeling his confidence rebuild with every mile that passed. "That's fine. You'll talk eventually. They always do." Still nothing. The silence stretched out, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. Norman glanced in the mirror again, studying his prisoner. Even cuffed and bleeding, the man looked dangerous. There was something coiled about him, something that suggested the restraints were a temporary inconvenience rather than a defeat. "You know what your mistake was," Norman said, needing to fill the silence, needing to hear himself explain why he'd been right to do this. "You thought you could intimidate me. All that talk about clearances and federal responses and chains of command. You thought I'd be too scared to call your bluff." Taylor's eyes shifted to the mirror, meeting Norman's gaze through the reflection. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle. "It wasn't a bluff. Sure it wasn't. You have made a grave error, son." The word son landed like a slap. Norman was 31 years old, a decorated officer with 5 years on the force, and this criminal was talking to him like he was a child who'd broken something valuable. His hands tightened on the wheel. "The only error here was you thinking you were above the law." "I never said I was above the law." Taylor's tone remained maddeningly even. "I said you didn't have the authority to detain me. There's a difference." Norman laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "You don't get it, do you? I've got all the authority I need. You're in my cruiser, in my county, heading to my station. Whatever you think you are, whatever you think you do, none of it matters now." "It will matter in approximately," Taylor's eyes flicked to the dashboard clock. 43 minutes. That's when the response team will arrive at your precinct." "Response team." Norman shook his head, grinning now despite himself. "You really committed to this story. I'll give you that. Most guys would have broken by now, or started begging or making deals, but you're still playing secret agent." "I'm not playing anything." "Right. You're a federal asset with classified equipment and a mysterious briefcase. Let me guess. You work for the CIA? NSA? Or maybe you're with some super-secret organization that doesn't even have a name. Taylor's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. I'm a commander in the United States Army Special Operations Command. My current assignment is classified. The briefcase contains materials related to an ongoing operation that you have now compromised. The vehicle you damaged is government property worth approximately $400,000. And the moment you ran my fingerprints, well, you triggered an alert that is currently climbing through channels you don't have clearance to know exist. The detail of it should have been impressive. The specificity, the calm delivery, the absolute conviction in Taylor's voice. It was a good performance. Norman had to admit that. But he'd heard 1,000 stories from 1,000 suspects, each one more elaborate than the last. The drug dealer who was actually an undercover DEA agent. The drunk driver who was rushing his pregnant wife to the hospital, despite being alone in the car. The guy with a trunk full of stolen electronics, who swore he was a private investigator on a case. "You know what?" Norman said, his grin widening. "I almost believe you. You've got the look down, the voice, the whole military bearing thing. But here's what you don't have. Any proof. No badge, or no credentials, no paperwork. Just a story and an expensive truck. The proof is coming. Sure it is." Norman took the exit toward town, the lights of the precinct visible in the distance. And when it doesn't, when your one phone call goes to some public defender who's going to tell you to take a plea deal, I want you to remember this moment. Remember when you had the chance to cooperate and you chose to play games instead. Taylor leaned back against the seat, his eyes closing. "I'm not the one playing games, officer, and I'm not the one who's going to need a lawyer." Norman's smile faltered for just a second before he forced it back. "Keep telling yourself that." But as the precinct grew closer, as the familiar parking lot came into view, with its flickering sodium lights and the flag hanging limp in the still night air, as Norman felt that whisper of doubt again. Felt it in the way Taylor had gone quiet, in the resignation on his face, in the way he'd said 43 minutes, like he was counting down to something inevitable. Norman crushed the doubt again, harder this time. He'd made the right call. He'd done his job. And in a few hours, when this guy was processed and booked and sitting in a cell, Norman would be the cop who'd taken down a major player without backup, without hesitation. He pulled into his parking spot and killed the engine, already imagining the looks on his colleagues' faces. He had no idea he had 39 minutes left before his entire world collapsed. The precinct at midnight had the atmosphere of a waiting room in purgatory, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, and the skeleton crew of night shift officers who looked up with mild interest as Norman hauled his prisoner through the front doors. Taylor moved with that same controlled grace, despite the cuffs, his boots squeaking slightly on the linoleum as Norman guided him past the front desk. "Got a live one, Norman," Officer Hendricks called from behind the plexiglass, not bothering to look up from his phone. "You have no idea," Norman said, unable to keep the pride out of his voice. "Caught him on 29. Refused to comply, resisted arrest, the whole 9 yards. Hendricks glanced up then, his eyes widening slightly as he took in Taylor's size and bearing. "He give you trouble? Nothing I couldn't handle?" Norman steered Taylor toward the booking area, past the holding cells where a drunk was singing something off-key and mournful. "Clear me a station. This one's going to take a while." The booking room was small and institutional, with concrete walls painted the color of depression and a metal desk bolted to the floor. Norman pushed Taylor into the chair, facing the fingerprint scanner and computer terminal, then uncuffed one wrist only to recuff it to the metal ring embedded in the desk. Taylor didn't resist, didn't speak, just sat there with that 1,000-yard stare that was starting to get under Norman's skin. All right, let's make this official. Norman dropped into the chair opposite and pulled up the booking form on the computer. Full name. Taylor said nothing. I asked you a question. I heard you. Norman's fingers hovered over the keyboard. You're required to identify yourself during booking. That's not optional. I'm not refusing to identify myself. I'm telling you that providing my full name and operational details to a local database represents a security breach I'm not authorized to make. Jesus Christ. Norman rubbed his eyes, feeling the adrenaline crash starting to hit. You're really going to keep this up? Even now? It's not an act. Fine. You want to play it that way? Norman typed John Doe into the name field with more force than necessary. Date of birth. Silence. Occupation. Nothing. Current address. Taylor's eyes remained fixed on the wall behind Norman's head, his expression carved from stone. Norman slammed his hand on the desk and making the computer monitor jump. You think this is helping you? You think refusing to cooperate makes you look innocent? I think, Taylor said quietly, that in approximately 27 minutes, none of this is going to matter. There you go again with the countdown. Norman leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. What happens in 27 minutes? Your secret agent friends bust through the walls. Something like that. Norman laughed, but it sounded hollow even to his own ears. You know what? I don't need you to talk. Technology's a beautiful thing. He grabbed Taylor's free hand and pulled it toward the fingerprint scanner, a sleek black pad connected to the computer. This'll tell me everything I need to know. For the first time since they'd entered the building, Taylor's composure cracked. His hand tensed, and fingers spreading as if to pull away, and his voice came out sharp. Officer, I strongly advise you not to run those prints. Why? They're going to come back with warrants? Outstanding charges? Norman pressed Taylor's thumb against the scanner, feeling a surge of vindication. Good. Makes my job easier. They're going to come back with a security flag that will end your career. Sure they will. The scanner beeped, capturing the print. Norman moved to the index finger, then the middle finger, working his way across Taylor's hand with methodical efficiency. You know how many times I've heard that? You're going to regret this, officer. I know people. You have no idea who you're messing with. It's always the same song, different verse. Taylor's jaw clenched as Norman finished the right hand and reached for the left. Oh, I'm not threatening you. I'm trying to warn you. Once those prints hit the federal database, there's no taking it back. Good thing I'm not planning to take it back. Norman completed the scan and released Taylor's hand, turning back to the computer with satisfaction. The prints were uploading, a progress bar crawling across the screen. Now we wait and see who you really are. You already know who I am. Yeah. Enlighten me. Colonel Patrick Taylor, United States Army Special Operations Command, currently assigned to... He stopped himself. Currently assigned to a unit I can't name in an unsecured location. Norman snorted. Colonel. That's a good one. Most guys go with something lower level, more believable. But you? You went straight for the top. I'm not lying. We'll see. The progress bar hit 100%, and Norman leaned forward, ready to see the truth. Probably a string of priors, maybe some outstanding warrants. Definitely proof that this guy was exactly what Norman thought he was. The screen flickered. Then it went red. Not a warning box or an error message. The entire screen turned the color of arterial blood, and text began scrolling across it in white capital letters. Security alert. Biometric match flagged. Department of Defense personnel file. Access restricted. Detainment protocol initiated. Contact DoD liaison immediately. Norman's stomach dropped. What the hell? The computer locked, the keyboard unresponsive. A high-pitched tone began emanating from the terminal, and Norman could hear Hendricks shouting something from the front desk. The screen continued its cascade of warnings. Unauthorized detention of federal asset. Alert transmitted to Joint Special Operations Command. Response team dispatched. Estimated arrival, 23 minutes. Norman's hands were shaking as he grabbed the mouse, clicking frantically, trying to close the window, trying to make it stop. Nothing worked. The screen just kept screaming its warnings in silent text, each line another nail in the coffin of his career. He looked up at Taylor, his face gone pale. What is this? What did you do? Taylor met his eyes, and there was no triumph there, no satisfaction, just exhaustion and something that looked like pity. I told you, he said quietly. I tried to tell you. The phone at the front desk began to ring, shrill and insistent in the sudden silence. Norman's world had just ended, and he didn't even know it yet. The phone kept ringing. Norman stood frozen in the booking room, staring at the blood-red screen, his brain refusing to process what he was seeing. Behind him, he could hear Hendricks answer the call, his voice going from casual to clipped in the span of a single sentence. Yes, this is Officer Hendricks. Yes. Yes, Wait, what? Sir, I don't... Yes, sir, right now. Yes, sir. The phone slammed down, and Hendricks's voice cracked across the precinct like a whip. Norman, get out here. Now! Norman's legs felt like water as he stumbled out of the booking room, leaving Taylor cuffed to the desk. The front area had transformed in the 60 seconds he'd been gone. Hendricks was on his feet, his face drained of color, and the night sergeant, a 20-year veteran named Morrison, who Norman had never seen rattled, was sprinting down the hallway toward the chief's office. What's going on? Norman's voice came out smaller than he intended. What's going on? Hendricks stared at him like he'd grown a second head. What the hell did you bring in here? That was the Department of Defense on the phone. The actual DoD. They said we're holding one of their assets and that we have... He checked his watch. 21 minutes to secure him before they come get him themselves. That's impossible. He's just what, Norman? Morrison had returned, moving fast for a man his size. Just some random guy you pulled over. Because I've got the Pentagon calling my personal cell phone, telling me to lock down this building and keep everyone away from your suspect. The chief's door flew open with enough force to crack against the wall. Captain Richard Voss emerged in wrinkled civilian clothes, his phone pressed to his ear, his face the color of old newspaper. He'd clearly been called in from home, hadn't even taken the time to put on his uniform. His eyes found Norman immediately, and the look in them made Norman's bowels turn to ice. I understand, General. Yes, sir. He's secured. No, sir, he hasn't been harmed beyond... Voss's eyes flicked to Norman, and his expression went from fear to fury. There was an altercation during the arrest. I'm looking at the officer responsible right now. Yes, sir. We'll have him ready for transfer. 20 minutes. Oh, understood. He lowered the phone, and the silence that followed felt like standing in a vacuum. Every officer in the building had stopped what they were doing. The drunk had stopped singing. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum quieter. Captain, I can explain. Norman started. "Shut your mouth!" Voss's voice was barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he'd shouted. "You don't speak. You don't move. You don't breathe unless I tell you to." He turned to Morrison. "Where is he?" "Booking room. Cuffed to the desk." "Get him out of there. Put him in the conference room, uncuff him, and get him whatever he needs. Water, coffee, a medic if he wants one." Voss was moving as he spoke, heading toward the booking room. "And someone tell me we didn't put him in the system." "His prints are already uploaded," Hendricks said weakly. "That's what triggered the alert." Voss stopped walking. His shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath, and when he turned back around, Norman saw something he'd never seen in his captain's face before. Genuine fear. "How bad is he hurt?" "Some scrapes, taser burns." Norman's voice died as Voss's eyes locked onto him. "You tasered him?" "He was resisting. He's a Delta Force commander, you goddamn idiot." Voss's composure shattered like glass. "He could have killed you with his bare hands, and you tasered him?" The words hung in the air. Delta Force. Norman's knees actually buckled, and he had to grab the desk to stay upright. Not a drug dealer. Not a criminal. A Delta Force commander. Of the kind of operator who didn't exist in official records, who ran missions that would never be declassified, who had probably killed more people than Norman had arrested in his entire career. "Oh, God," Norman whispered. "Yeah. Oh, God." Voss pushed past him into the booking room. Through the doorway, Norman could see Taylor sitting exactly as he'd left him, still cuffed, still calm. Voss approached him like he was defusing a bomb. "Colonel Taylor, I'm Captain Richard Voss. I'm the commanding officer of this precinct, and I want to apologize for—" "Save it." Taylor's voice was tired. "Just get these cuffs off me and clear the building. The response team won't wait for explanations." Voss fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the cuffs. Taylor pulled his wrists free, rubbing the red marks where the metal had bitten into skin. He stood slowly, rolling his shoulders, and even that simple movement carried a lethal grace that made everyone in the room take an involuntary step back. "How long?" Voss asked. Taylor checked his watch. 18 minutes, maybe less if they pushed it. "What do we need to do?" "Clear your parking lot. Have your officers holster their weapons and keep their hands visible. When they arrive, do not approach the vehicles. Do not speak unless spoken to. And for God's sake," Taylor's eyes found Norman through the doorway, "keep him away from me." That's when Norman heard it, a sound like distant thunder, growing louder. Not thunder. Rotors. Multiple helicopters inbound, moving fast. "They're early," Taylor said quietly, as the front windows of the precinct suddenly blazed with light, not the red and blue of police vehicles, but the harsh white of tactical floods. Norman stumbled to the window and looked out, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. The parking lot was surrounded. Black SUVs with government plates, armored Humvees, and at least a dozen soldiers in full tactical gear, their rifles held at low ready. They'd materialized like ghosts, forming a perimeter so tight a mouse couldn't have escaped. The front doors burst open without warning. No knock, no announcement. 6 operators in multicam fatigues and plate carriers flooded in, their weapons up, their movements synchronized like a choreographed dance. The lead man's eyes swept the room, assessed the threat level in a microsecond, and his rifle lowered fractionally. "Building secure," he said into his radio. "Package located." A figure stepped through the door behind them, and Norman felt what was left of his world crumble. The man wore an army dress uniform, with stars on his shoulders. Not 1 star. Not 2. 3 stars. A lieutenant general, flanked by 2 men in dark suits who had "Federal Agent" written all over them. The general's eyes found Taylor immediately. "Colonel, are you injured?" "Nothing that won't heal, sir." Taylor moved toward him, and the operators parted like water. The general's gaze shifted to Voss, then to Norman, and the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. "Which one of you is responsible for this clusterfuck?" Every eye in the precinct turned to Norman, and he felt his bladder threaten to let go. The cavalry had arrived. And Norman was no longer the arresting officer. He was the suspect. The general didn't wait for an answer. His eyes had already identified Norman, the only officer in the room who looked like he was about to vomit, and dismissed him in the same glance. He turned his attention back to Taylor, his voice dropping to something almost paternal. "Patrick, I need you to tell me exactly what happened." Taylor's posture shifted subtly, his shoulders squaring. Even battered and disheveled, he snapped into a bearing that made every cop in the room look like they were playing dress-up. "Sir, I was returning from the briefing at Bragg when I was pulled over on Highway 29 at approximately 2300 hours. The officer cited a broken tail light as probable cause, although the vehicle had passed inspection 14 days prior. Did you identify yourself?" "I informed him I was a federal asset and requested he contact his supervisor. He refused. I warned him multiple times that I was not at liberty to answer his questions or consent to a search due to the classified nature of my assignment. He interpreted this as obstruction." The general's jaw tightened. "And the physical altercation?" "I used passive resistance only, sir. I did not strike back or attempt to escape. He deployed his taser and effected the arrest." Taylor's voice remained flat, professional, but Norman could hear the edge beneath it, the restraint it was taking not to say what he really thought. "The equipment?" "Briefcase is intact. The vehicle sustained damage, broken window, possible damage to the rear security system. I won't know the extent until I can run diagnostics." The general nodded, then turned to one of the suited men. "Agent Carver, I want a full report on my desk by 0600. Include everything, dashcam footage, booking records, witness statements, everything." The agent stepped forward, and Norman finally got a good look at him. Mid-40s, grey suit, the kind of face that had seen too much and forgotten how to be surprised by human stupidity. He pulled a leather credentials case from his pocket and flipped it open. "Special Agent Marcus Carver, FBI. I'm here as part of a joint DOD-DOJ task force investigating potential security breaches involving classified military personnel." He walked directly to Norman, who was still frozen by the window, and the room seemed to contract around them. "Officer Joel Norman, you are being detained for questioning regarding potential violations of federal law, including but not limited to interference with a federal officer in the performance of their duties, unlawful detention of a military asset, destruction of government property, and possible compromise of classified national security operations." Norman's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His brain had stopped processing words, could only focus on the phrase federal law and the way everyone was looking at him like he was radioactive. "You have the right to remain silent," Carver continued, his voice carrying the bored efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights as I've explained them to you?" Norman's voice cracked. "I was just doing my job." "That wasn't the question. Do you understand your rights?" Norman nodded, then realized that wasn't enough. "Yes." "Good." Carver produced a pair of handcuffs, federal ones, heavier than the ones Norman carried, and Norman felt his soul leave his body. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "Wait, you're arresting me?" The words came out as a whimper. "I'm detaining you pending investigation. There's a difference, but in your case I wouldn't count on it staying that way." Carver's hands were professional, efficient, as he cuffed Norman with the same mechanical precision Norman had used on Taylor hours earlier. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. Captain Voss stepped forward, his face ashen. "Agent Carver, Officer Norman is suspended effective immediately, pending the outcome of your investigation. He'll cooperate fully with—" "Captain, with all due respect, what Officer Norman does or doesn't do is no longer your concern. This is a federal matter now." Carver guided Norman toward one of the chairs, forcing him to sit. "You'll stay here until we're ready to transport you for questioning." Norman sat, the cuffs biting into his wrists, and watched his career die in real time. Across the room, Taylor was speaking quietly with the general, their conversation too low to hear. One of the operators had produced a first aid kit and was checking the scrapes on Taylor's face, but the colonel waved him off. "Sir, I need to retrieve the briefcase from evidence," Taylor said. The general nodded. "Agent Carver, can you facilitate that?" "Already done." One of the other agents appeared carrying the hard-shell case, still sealed, still intact. He handed it to Taylor with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "We'll need to document the chain of custody, but it hasn't been opened." Taylor took the case, his fingers running over the biometric lock, checking the seals. Satisfied, he tucked it under his arm and turned toward the door. He made it 3 steps before he stopped, his eyes finding Norman across the room. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The operator and the cop, the professional and the amateur, the man who'd tried to warn him, and the man who wouldn't listen. Norman wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but his throat had closed up, and his eyes were burning with tears he refused to let fall. Taylor's expression softened, just slightly. Not forgiveness. Norman didn't deserve that, and they both knew it. But something closer to pity, the kind you'd give to someone who'd just destroyed their own life through sheer stupidity. "You should have called your supervisor," Taylor said quietly. Then he turned and walked toward the door, the general and his security detail falling in around him. Norman watched him go, watched the way the operators moved with him like they were parts of the same organism, watched the way even the general deferred to him with the respect earned through blood and sacrifice, watched the matte black briefcase that probably contained intelligence worth more than Norman would make in his entire lifetime, and carried by a man Norman had tasered and beaten and called a criminal. The front doors opened, and Taylor stepped out into the night. The floods from the tactical vehicles illuminated him for a moment, turning him into a silhouette against the glare. And then he was gone, swallowed by the convoy of SUVs that would take him back to whatever shadow war he was fighting. The doors closed, and the precinct fell silent, except for the quiet sobbing of Officer Joel Norman, who'd wanted so badly to be a hero that he'd become the villain in someone else's story. Captain Voss stood over him, his voice hollow. "You're done, Norman. Not just here. Everywhere. No department will touch you after this." Norman didn't respond. He just sat there in his own handcuffs, in his own precinct, surrounded by his former colleagues who wouldn't meet his eyes, and waited for the federal agents to take him away. Outside, the helicopters lifted off one by one, their rotors beating the air like war drums, carrying Colonel Patrick Taylor back to the classified world where men like Norman didn't exist, and mistakes like this could cost lives. The last thing Norman saw before Agent Carver pulled him to his feet was the red screen of the booking computer, still flashing its warnings into the empty room, a digital epitaph for a career that had ended the moment he'd decided a broken taillight was worth investigating. He'd wanted to catch a kingpin. Instead, he'd caught a reckoning. If this story had you gripping your seat, hit that like button and drop a comment below. If you were Colonel Taylor, could you have shown the same restraint Norman experienced on that highway? So don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We've got more tales of shattered egos, tactical justice, and the moment arrogance meets consequence headed your way. Share this with someone who needs to see what happens when authority collides with real power. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.